$240 million. That is the number Congress latched onto. $240 million. A single unmanned aircraft pulled out of the sky over Iranian territory. No crew to recover. No wreckage returned. No satisfying explanation from the Pentagon that quieted anyone on the Armed Services Committee. The hearings ran for 3 days. 17 separate congressional statements used the word lost. 16 used the word failure. Wrong word, wrong math. Here is the equation the auditors never ran. That $240 million drone may have been the least expensive piece of hardware the United States Navy committed to the Persian Gulf campaign. Not in spite of the price tag, but because of what that machine delivered in the 19 hours before it stopped transmitting. We are going to run the real math today. The MQ-4C Triton is not a tactical aircraft. It was not designed to fight anything. It was designed to see everything. The airframe begins with a 130-foot wingspan, larger than a Boeing 737. Service ceiling, 56,500 feet, roughly twice the cruising altitude of a commercial airliner and above the engagement envelope of every Iranian short-range and medium-range air defense system in the inventory. Endurance, more than 24 hours on station without returning to base. Sensor suite, AN/ZPOY-3. Multifunction active sensor radar, capable of scanning more than 2 million square nautical miles per sortie. Electro-optical and infrared cameras, SIGINT collection packages, and a maritime identification system that can track hundreds of surface contacts simultaneously. That is not a weapon. That is an eye. And the critical detail, the one that defines everything that follows, is the altitude. At 56,500 feet, the Triton sits above the reach of Iran's Rod, its Sevam Khordad, its Khordad 15. It operates in an altitude band where, for years, the only Iranian system capable of reaching it was the Russian-supplied S-300 PMU-2, and Iran's S-300 batteries are positioned around Tehran and the nuclear sites at Fordo and Natanz. Not around Bandar Abbas, not around the Strait of Hormuz, which means for a long time the Triton orbited the Iranian coast with effective impunity. The Navy had been rotating Tritons out of Al Dhafra Air Base in the UAE for months before the engagement. Standard ISR patterns. Long elliptical orbits tracking northeast from the Strait of Hormuz along the Iranian coastline, past Keshem Island, past Bandar Abbas, past the IRGC Navy bases at Jask and Chabahar. The Iranians knew the aircraft was there. The radar returns were not classified information. What Iran did not have for most of that deployment was a system in the right location capable of reaching it. That changed when the Bavar 373 moved. We will come back to that move in a moment, because before we talk about how the Triton died, we need to talk about what it was doing on its final sortie, and why those 19 hours matter more than the $240 million price tag on the congressional slide. The Triton had been on station for 19 hours when the Iranian fire control radar illuminated. In those 19 hours, the aircraft had been executing a high-resolution mapping pass of the Iranian coastal defense architecture in the northern Persian Gulf, the kind of systematic collection that CENTCOM uses to build targeting packages before any strike campaign begins. The kind of work that, if you skip it, sends strike aircraft into airspace you do not understand and cannot safely navigate. Here is what the Triton sensors had catalogued by the time the Bavar 373 missile launched. 14 Iranian coastal SAM batteries. Not just their grid positions, their radar emission profiles, their frequency agility patterns, their antenna rotation rates, their engagement arcs, their coverage overlaps, and, critically, their blind spots. Every gap in the radar fence that a strike package could thread. Every angle of approach that left an aircraft outside an engagement arc long enough to execute a weapon release and egress without triggering a tracking lock. 3. Khorramshahr, 4 ballistic missile launch sites. This is the number that mattered most to the carrier strike group commanders. The Khorramshahr-4 is Iran's most capable medium-range ballistic missile, a two-stage system with a reported range of 2,000 kilometers and a claimed circular error probable of 30 meters. It is the system that, if it found a carrier, could end that carrier. Locating those 3 launch sites, their coordinates, their access roads, their pre-launch preparation signatures, was not a secondary collection objective. That was the primary mission. And the full-duty rotation of the Air Defense Command Post at Bandar Abbas. Shift change times. Radar sweep gaps between rotations. The specific window, 14 minutes, between 0340 and 0354 local time, when the primary tracking radar at Bandar Abbas cycled to stand by for a scheduled maintenance interval. 14 minutes in which a low observable platform could cross certain approach geometries without triggering an engagement response. That information was not stored on the aircraft. It was transmitted via Ku-band satellite link to CENTCOM Air Operations Center in Qatar, in real time, throughout the entire 19-hour collection period. By the time the Bavar 373 reached the Triton's altitude, every piece of that data was already in the hands of the strike planners. The drone did not take its collection to the bottom of the Gulf. It sent it home first. I spent time going through the open-source reconstruction of the targeting methodology that emerged from the 9-day strike campaign, the documented suppression sequences, the approach geometry choices, the strike timing patterns, and one detail kept demanding attention. In 9 days of carrier aviation operations over Iranian territory, the United States did not lose a single aircraft to an Iranian surface-to-air missile. Not one. In a threat environment containing 14 active coastal batteries plus organic IRGC air defense at multiple layered sites, that number is not luck. That is a map. A map built at 56,000 feet and transmitted from a dying aircraft to the people who needed it. Now, let us look at the math, because this is where the congressional accounting completely falls apart. The loaded question from the Armed Services Committee: how do you justify $240 million for an aircraft you could not protect? Here is the right question. What would the campaign have cost without it? An Arleigh Burke class guided missile destroyer carries a procurement cost of $2.1 billion in current figures. That number buys a hull of 510 feet, 96 vertical launch cells in the Mark 41 VLS, a crew of approximately 330, and a combat system built over decades of integration and refinement. The Burke is the backbone of Carrier Strike Group Escort. It is also the platform that operates closest to the Iranian coastline when the carrier group needs protected sea room. During the 9-day campaign enabled by the Triton's final collection package, at least 2 Arleigh Burke destroyers operated within the engagement envelopes of Iranian coastal SAM batteries. Moving through threat arcs they could navigate safely only because the Triton had mapped those arcs in advance and identified the approach geometries that kept them below the active radar horizon. The targeting package the Triton delivered was not just protecting F/A-18S on strike runs. It was protecting $4.2 billion in destroyer hulls. Here is the full equation. $240 million committed to the Triton program for that sortie. $4.2 billion in destroyer assets operating under the protection of the intelligence it delivered. 0 U.S. aircraft or surface combatants lost to Iranian air defense over 9 days of carrier operations. That is a 17-to-1 return on the asset you just lost, measured in the assets that came home because the drone was there. But we have not talked about the other side of the ledger yet. The system that shot down the Triton was not cheap. The Bavar 373 is Iran's domestically developed long-range surface-to-air missile system, unveiled in 2019 as a replacement for the Russian S-300 as Iran was denied under international pressure. Maximum engagement altitude, above 75,000 feet, per Iranian state claims, high enough to reach the Triton with significant margin. Range, 200 kilometers. The complete battery package, fire control radar, command vehicle, launcher, missiles, costs between $180 million and $220 million, based on independent defense procurement analysis and cross-referenced Iranian budget estimates. Let us run that number. Iran spent at minimum $180 million in deployed air defense infrastructure, plus the cost of an interceptor missile to engage one aircraft that cost $240 million. That is a near-symmetrical cost exchange on paper. But here's what makes it devastating for Iran in practice: that $180 million battery achieved a 26-hour disruption to U.S. strike planning. Not a defeat of the strike plan. Not a permanent degradation of U.S. ISR capability over the theater. A 26-hour hold on one strike package, which was subsequently executed successfully using an alternate sensor fusion built from an RC-135V rivet joint, repositioning and satellite overflight. 26 hours for $180 million. The Triton, in its final sortie, spent $240 million and enabled 9 days of carrier air operations with 0 aircraft losses. Run the attrition math. The drone was not the liability. The drone was the investment. Subscribe to Navy Powerline, because what we just showed you is the equation that never made it into the congressional record. Now, here is the part that gets complicated, because the 26-hour hold was not a minor scheduling inconvenience. The strike package that was held, Super Hornets tasked against a Bandar Abbas radar installation, was held because the targeting picture had a gap. The Triton had collected on 17 of the 18 threat elements in the strike corridor. The 18th, a specific radar node on the eastern approach that the Triton had not yet swept when the intercept occurred, required verification before the strike lead could clear his package for execution. For 26 hours, the air wing sat on deck. Air crews briefed, aircraft loaded, and the mission waiting on a single data point that the RC-135V repositioning had to provide. 26 hours in which Iranian ground forces could observe the operational pause, could read from the silence that something had changed overhead, could adapt their SAM battery dispositions under the reduced surveillance pressure that the Triton's absence created. The follow-on collection eventually rebuilt the picture. The RC-135V, operating at lower altitude and carrying more crew risk than the Triton had accepted, got the data. The strike executed. The radar node went down. But that hold revealed something the post-action briefings confirmed without advertising. The campaign architecture had been built around an assumption of continuous Triton coverage that the Bavar 373 had just invalidated. The system compensated. But compensating cost 26 hours and put a manned ISR crew into a threat envelope they had not planned to enter when the deployment began. That is the detail that most coverage of the Triton loss never reached. Here is what I find most surprising about the Iranian decision to commit the Bavar 373 to this engagement. Tehran almost certainly knew the data transaction that was happening in real time. Iranian SIGINT assets were capable of detecting the satellite uplinks the Triton was generating. They could not read the encrypted data. The protection on those transmission systems is serious, but they could observe the volume and continuity of the uplink traffic. They knew the aircraft had been collecting for 19 hours. They knew the data was already transmitted before the missile reached intercept altitude. They fired anyway, because the Bavar 373 intercept was not primarily a military calculation. It was an information operation. The headline value of shooting down a $240 million American surveillance drone over Iranian territory, the domestic messaging inside Iran, the regional signaling to Gulf states, the congressional theater it would predictably trigger in Washington, was worth more to Tehran's strategic communication posture than any realistic military objective the intercept could achieve. Iran was not playing the battlefield equation. It was playing the news cycle. Here is our take, and we will say it directly. The congressional reaction to the Triton loss was not just wrong in its analysis, it was a gift to Tehran's information operation. When legislators stand before cameras and call the loss a strategic failure, citing the $240 million number without running the equation, demanding accountability for a decision that, by every measurable military metric, produced a net positive outcome, they are completing Iran's messaging campaign. For free. Tehran did not need a communications budget for that news cycle. Washington provided one at no charge. The commanders who understood what the Triton had actually accomplished said very little publicly in the weeks that followed. That is not evasion. That is the correct response when your opponent is publicly celebrating a transaction that objectively favored you. Now, there is a second layer to this exchange that gets almost no analytical attention, and it changes the equation further. Every operational use of the Bavar 373 under real engagement conditions is a data collection event. And in this case, it was a data event the United States was recording in real time. When the Bavar 373 fire control radar illuminated the Triton, every U.S. SIGINT asset within collection range was recording. Frequency, pulse repetition interval, scan pattern, track file geometry, mode transitions as the system moved from acquisition to track to engagement. The complete emission signature of a Bavar 373 operating under live combat conditions against a real target. Iran had exercised the system before. U.S. analysts had its general emission parameters on file, but an exercise is a rehearsal. A live engagement, under real operational pressure, with a real target at the edge of the engagement envelope, produces different data. Operators respond differently under pressure. The system is pushed into edge case operating modes that exercises never reveal. The data is categorically different in quality. Iran's decision to fire gave the electronic warfare engineers at Patuxent River, the people building the jamming systems that will fly on the next-generation Growler and its successors, a laboratory-quality dataset on how the Bavar 373 behaves when it is actually trying to bring something down. The price of that dataset? $240 million, which is, by the standards of electronic warfare research programs, not expensive for what it returned. Type Triton in the comments if you think the electronic warfare data from that engagement changes the long-term calculus more than the immediate drone loss does. Now, let us build the full picture, because the Triton story is not about one aircraft. It is about a doctrine, and what happens to that doctrine when the threat ceiling rises. The Navy's persistent ISR architecture over a contested theater like the Persian Gulf operates on a layered model. At the top tier, satellites. Continuous overhead coverage in principle, but constrained in dwell time over specific targets, constrained in sensor resolution at orbital altitude, and fundamentally unresponsive to tactical redirection. You cannot task a satellite to extend its orbit over an area of interest the way you can task an aircraft. Below satellites, persistent unmanned platforms at extreme altitude. The Triton. 24 hours of orbit, responsive, retaskable mid-mission, capable of dwelling over a specific target area for as long as the collection requirement demands, close enough to the threat to see fine sensor detail, high enough to be above most of what can reach it, until recently. Below the Triton tier, manned ISR aircraft, the RC-135V rivet joint, the EP-3E Ares II, the P-8 Poseidon in its SIGINT configuration, operating at medium altitude inside the engagement envelopes of the systems the Triton was flying above. Higher crew risk, shorter dwell per sortie, more adaptable because of human judgment, but more expensive to sustain in a contested environment over time. Below that, organic ISR on strike platforms. The EA-18G Growler in the SEAD and electronic attack role. The sensor suites on the F/A-18E/F Block 3. Targeting pods pulling tactical intelligence on the targets they are servicing in real time. The Triton sits at the second tier, the persistent, high-altitude, long-dwell layer. When it is operating, every tier below it works with a pre-built picture. The Burke commander knows where the SAMs are. The strike package lead knows the radar gaps. The Growler crew knows which specific frequency to jam and at precisely which point in the engagement timeline to apply it. When the Triton is absent, every tier below it compensates by accepting additional risk. Put yourself in the position of the carrier air wing commander during that 26-hour hold. Your strike package is ready. Your air crews are briefed. Your weapons are configured. And the threat picture has a gap. One data point unverified, one radar node whose current status you cannot confirm without either sending a manned ISR aircraft into a threat envelope that just demonstrated it could bring down your Triton, or waiting for satellite geometry to provide adequate resolution on a target that keeps maneuvering. You hold, correctly, because 18 of the 19 data points you have came from an aircraft that is now gone. And the one you are missing could be the one that costs you a Super Hornet and a 2-person crew. No strike package lead in the world clears that flight without closing that gap first. That is the real weight of the ISR loss, not the $240 million on the invoice. The weight is the 26 hours of decisions that have to be made against an incomplete picture, and the human cost of the manned assets that fly lower and slower to fill the gap the Triton was filling for free from 56,000 feet. We showed you in the video on USS Tripoli and the LCAC deployment how the amphibious assault architecture depends on persistent overhead intelligence to sequence the approach corridors, how the hovercraft can fly over the mine problem, but only when someone has already confirmed what the mine problem looks like. The Triton was the system doing that confirmation work for the entire theater. Its absence changes the geometry of every operation that follows until coverage is restored. What strikes us analytically about this exchange is something that gets almost no attention in the public discourse on Iran's air defense posture. The investment in the Bandar 373 program was never primarily designed to achieve large-scale attrition of U.S. aircraft. The inventory is too small and too expensive for attrition-based air defense. It was designed to contest the high-altitude ISR tier, to force the Triton to operate at the edge of survivability, to degrade its collection through the threat of engagement, or to make its presence over Iranian airspace cost money every time it orbits. One successful intercept per deployment cycle forces the Navy to choose between accepting the ISR gap and filling it with manned platforms that carry more risk. Either choice costs more at every layer than the Triton cost. That is the strategic math the Bandar 373 was built to generate. The question is whether that math achieves what Iran intended. Based on the evidence of this campaign, it achieved one news cycle and one 26-hour tactical hold. It did not achieve meaningful disruption to the 9 days of carrier air operations that the intercepted aircraft had already enabled before it went dark. Will Iran run that equation the same way next time? Comment yes or no, because the answer changes whether the Triton's replacement needs to be faster, stealthier, or simply present in larger numbers. Now the open question, and it is a genuine one that has no clean answer yet. The MQ-4C Triton fleet is not large. The Navy has taken delivery of fewer than 10 operational airframes, with the program having survived multiple near cancellations driven by budget pressure over the past decade. The unit cost runs to approximately $180 million to $240 million per airframe, depending on the sensor configuration. Every loss is felt across the program's force structure. The persistence model that makes the Triton strategically valuable requires multiple aircraft to maintain continuous coverage of a theater. To sustain one Triton continuously on station over a 24-hour orbit, you need at minimum 3 airframes in rotation, 1 flying, 1 returning, 1 preparing for the next sortie. Lose 1 to a combat intercept, and your coverage cycle degrades. Lose 2, and you are flying manned ISR assets into the gap full-time. This is the question the Navy is now sitting with. Is the Triton's high-altitude persistent orbit still viable against an adversary who has demonstrated both the capability and the operational willingness to contest it? Or does the persistent ISR mission over a contested Persian Gulf theater migrate toward a different architecture, lower observable platforms, larger numbers of smaller unmanned systems, standoff collection from outside the threat envelope, or some combination of all three? The detail that stuck with me reviewing the post-campaign assessments is this. The Triton's final mission was a success by every military metric that matters. The aircraft completed its collection. It transmitted its data. It enabled the campaign that followed without a single U.S. aircraft lost to Iranian air defense. It died doing exactly what it was designed to do. But the system that replaced it, the RC-135 repositioning, the adjusted satellite overflight schedule, the manned aircraft accepting additional risk to fill the gap, was not designed to perform that function on a sustained basis. It was designed to bridge a temporary gap. The temporary gap becomes a permanent question when the system that created the gap keeps existing. Here is the part nobody in the congressional hearings asked. If the Triton tier of the ISR architecture is now contested over the Persian Gulf, what fills it? What provides the 24-hour persistent high-altitude collection picture that the Navy's strike planning architecture depends on? At what cost? And against an adversary with more advanced long-range air defense systems than Iran, a near-peer adversary operating S-400 or HQ-9B, does any current unmanned platform at any altitude provide genuine persistent ISR without accepting losses at a rate the program cannot sustain? Whatever that answer is, and the Navy has several programs in advanced development that point toward it, the lesson of the Triton's final sortie is already embedded in the doctrine that follows. Persistence wins. Data wins. The aircraft that can see everything from 56,000 feet and transmit it home before it dies wins, even when the aircraft does not survive. Drop equation in the comments if you want us to break down what the next-generation persistent ISR architecture looks like, and why the conventional high-altitude endurance drone formula may be approaching the limit of its strategic useful life. Subscribe to Navy Powerline, because what almost broke the carrier air campaign was not the loss of a $240 million aircraft. It was a 26-hour gap in a picture that aircraft had already filled. $240 million. 14 SAM batteries mapped. 3 Khorramshahr. 4 launch sites located. 1 14-minute radar maintenance window catalogued and transmitted. 9 days of carrier air operations executed without a single U.S. aircraft lost to Iranian air defense. And a real-time laboratory report on the Bavar 373's operational emission signature, delivered to the electronic warfare community at no additional cost. Iran spent $180 million minimum, burned an irreplaceable radar signature under live engagement conditions, generated one favorable news cycle, and achieved a 26-hour tactical hold on one strike package. Run both sides of the ledger. The drone died. The mission succeeded. Subscribe to Navy Powerline. We do not celebrate weapons. We calculate whether they work. The Triton worked.